So we're talking a bit about conspiracy theories of the Trumpist kind, the Clintonite kind. Really, the kind of ultimate conspiracy theorist of our age is Alex Jones. And he suffered a pretty humiliating defeat in court last week. He's been ordered to pay nearly $50 million to one of the families or the parents of one of the victims of the Sandy Hook massacre, which Jones infamously declared a false flag attack, a kind of government attempt to G up support for gun control laws. I mean, Tom, what do you make of the way that Alex Jones is kind of held up as this, almost like this, the person who invented lying and disinformation in American politics?
No, he's become very significant, not least over the Trump era, when there was a very kind of active attempt, partly on his part, but also on the liberal media's part, to connect the two, to paint them as kind of part of the same movement, all the rest of it. And was also one of the kind of early victims of big tech censorship. So he got kicked off of all of the main platforms in 2017, I think. He was kind 18. One of kind of string of high profile people who increasingly got kicked off. It was funny, back in those days, they made a point of saying it wasn't about conspiracy theories, it was about hate speech. Although now conspiracy theories can definitely get you kicked off as well. And he's really become the kind of center of the sort of post-truth panic, if you will, which has been quite alarming insofar as it's justified all kinds of quite Orwellian censorship, which is a bad idea anyway. I mean, I think censorship is far more dangerous than any conspiracy theory, and it also has a habit of fueling conspiracy theories, so it's not a good idea. But I think it's also allowed the kind of mainstream establishment off the hook, really, in terms of mainstreaming a kind of slightly jaundiced conspiratorial view of the world. One of the famous things that Jones will return to is kind of one of these classic conspiracy theory tropes, which is satanic paedophiles. They're not just Satanists, they're not just paedophiles, they're satanic paedophiles. Sometimes they're interdimensional.
Sometimes globalists, even more disgusting.
Even more horrendous. And, that was a pretty mainstream panic back in the 1980s in America as well as Britain. So there's this attempt to kind of just isolate him and treat him as if he's the only problem, as well as a means to kind of a rolling of the pitch, if you like, for more and more extensive censorship. It's not to defend what he did in this particular instance, calling Sandy Hook a false flag and stuff is very disgusting, etc. But it's quite clear that he's been set up as, not in this trial, but he's been held up, shall we say, as all that's wrong with the world. And I think that's is both wrong and quite dangerous in terms of the consequences of it.
I mean, Freddie, Tom alluded to this kind of connection between Alex Jones and, the Trump movement. And, Alex Jones was even at January 6th and things like that. I mean, what do you make of that connection? Does it speak to that kind of broader conspiratorial
Well, if in your
thinking?
darker moments you do think perhaps the world is run by satanic paedophiles, you would think that the last few weeks they've been on a bit of a roll, the satanic paedophiles, because the Trump FBI raid, the Alex Jones thing, Steve Bannon's prosecution, which is, I mean, extraordinary. I think every lawyer in America who's not insanely anti-Trump or anti-Steve Bannon thinks that this is trumped up and ridiculous. So you've got, Steve Bannon famously says it's not the deep state, it's the in-your-face state. Well, they are getting in the face of the Trump movement or just the sort of wacky media world around Trump. And then, as Tom says, with Alex Jones, the Sandy Hook stuff was obviously insane, and I think it's right that the parents should be able to sue, and if they win the case, fair enough. What I find weird is like the sort of, it's not enough, we've got to completely destroy him. Perjury, let's put him in jail forever. Alex Jones is a comedian, effectively. He's not even a sort of, it's not real journalism, and also everybody assumes that, I mean, it's true that in the post-truth world that people do sort of ride between believing it and not believing it at the same time, and it's a bit dangerous that we don't believe in truth. But this applies to everything now, not just Alex Jones. And Alex Jones is almost better than a lot of media because it's so obviously absurd. And you can just go, oh, he's just going off on one. Whereas if you watch Morning Joe or MSNBC, you're supposed to take everything they say very seriously, even though often it's as ridiculous, I would say.
And has
not quite as ridiculous.
And has a much kind of bigger impact, because policy is formed around that, because police investigations are launched in relation to that. If you think about, the UK and the VIP paedophile scandal. This complete nonsense fabricated by this fantasist and convicted paedophile, as it turned out, himself. This was peddled by the likes of James O'Brien, the respectable media. They leapt on it. They didn't challenge it whatsoever.
Tom Watson, the deputy Labour leader.
Exactly. No one was ever really held to account for that, as it turns out. But also, it had a real tangible consequence. People had their names dragged through the mud. They were subjected to all these trials. A lot of the men accused in that kind of died whilst awaiting their fate and all the rest of it. Someone who watches Alex Jones takes it a bit too seriously and maybe, shows up at a pizza restaurant or whatever, that does happen, and that is condemnable. But at the same time, in terms of its real impact on life and society, these mainstream kind of acceptable Martha's Vineyard version of conspiracy thinking are much more dangerous. Definitely.
I've got an Alex Jones story, if I may share it.
Please.
I sat next to him once at a dinner. Don't ask me why. And
the fan club.
and obviously I knew who he was, and I was talking to him, and he had a completely different voice. He was being quite normal. And then I said
French
something.
Or something.
He was like, so nice to meet you. And so we were just talking. Then I asked him a question that I think he suddenly thought, oh God, I'm talking to a journalist.
Yeah.
And then he suddenly went, well, the elites are terrified because, and he changed character.
Yeah.
He just so it's an act, it's a shtick. And I'm sorry to have exposed him, but everybody knows this, right?
Yeah.
That it's a performance routine because he's like a clown.
You mean you don't believe that the chemicals in the water are turning the frogs gay, or
don't think
the
that he
US
actually thinks
government is,
obviously, I think
you know, manipulating the weather.
So the reason there's a water shortage is because we all know that the frogs are turning gay.
Yeah. Coincided with monkeypox. I'm just asking questions here.
Have you seen the country music clip that somebody has turned Alex Jones's rants into a country music song?
Brilliant.
And it's one of the funniest things I've seen. I recommend you people watching should look it up.
You got a favourite song? Alex Jones moment?
I think you've stolen the water's turning the frogs gay. You can't really get much better than that. Him talking about eating his neighbours.
That's a good one.
That was good as well.